Mr President, thank you. I move the motion standing in my name.
Seconded.
Mr President, the motion that I am moving today also relates to the rental crisis engulfing our state, but in particular it relates to the need to regulate the short-term rental market. In particular, it calls on the Malinauskas government to cap the number of nights a property can be rented as short-term accommodation. It calls for a cap on the number of properties that can be rented for short-term accommodation. And it also calls for the government to look at incentivising the return of short-term accommodation to the long-term rental market. And in making the case for action, I do want to highlight to this chamber some of the key statistics. The waitlist for social housing now in South Australia has grown to more than 17,000 people. The availability of long-term rental accommodation continues to diminish. In fact, according to the latest figures from property research firm CoreLogic, and these were released back in January, I think that it's actually got worse since then, the rental vacancy rate in Adelaide has dropped to just 0.4%. There are high rates of rental stress. On census night, 30.5% of all renter households, or 58,177 renter households here in South Australia, are paying more than 30% of their household income on rent. Rent prices are spiralling out of control. And what is the Malinauskas government doing? Access to safe and secure housing is one of our most basic human rights. Yet here in South Australia, we have people sleeping in cars, tents and on the street because of a lack of available rental accommodation. And, Mr President, this is particularly an issue in regional South Australia, where we have some properties that are sitting vacant for 6 months of the year, while we have people in those communities sleeping in tents. A few years ago now, when I first started in this role, I travelled to Port Lincoln and I met with a number of community groups. And one of the issues that they're confronting at the moment is the lack of affordable rental accommodation in that community. The cause of that is the COVID-19 pandemic initially, because during that time, of course, there was not interstate or overseas travel. A number of South Australians elected to therefore travel intrastate, that is to engage in travel from, say, Adelaide over to Port Lincoln or other regional centres. And therefore a number of landlords found it more desirable to move their accommodation off the long-term rental market and into the short-stay market, because they could make a lot more money. That's resulted in a shortage of affordable rental accommodation in those regions, and it is contributing to the turbocharging of the market that we're seeing at the moment. And that's why the Greens are suggesting, well, there should be a cap on the number of nights that a property is on Airbnb, and we're suggesting that there be some incentives put on the table as part of the Malinauskas government's second budget to encourage those who own Airbnbs to move those into the long-term market. That would be a really good outcome. The other issue I should highlight that the Greens have been looking at is the need to target vacant dwellings. On census night back in 2021, there were 83,821 vacant homes in South Australia. Now, some people will say, oh, look, a lot of those might be, you're staying with a friend or visiting mum and dad or whatever, and that may well be the case. But even if only half of those properties were vacant on census night, that's a lot of vacant property in our state, particularly when we consider we have almost 20,000 people on the social housing wait list, not to mention the thousands of South Australians that are now experiencing housing stress and can't afford a place to live or a place to rent. In terms of looking at how to regulate this area, I'd encourage the Malinauskas government to look at Berlin. Back in 2016, they implemented some of the world's strictest laws for vacation rentals. It prohibited home sharing except for people wanting to rent out of extra rooms or who received one of a small number of government permits. Official reports by the end of 2017 noted that they had returned about 4,000 apartments to the long-term rental market and collected $3.2 million in fines. Amsterdam has also looked at this. They've set limits for 30 nights per year that a home can be booked out on Airbnb. Beyond this time, planning permission is needed to change the use of the property. This measure resulted in 80% of properties previously listed on Airbnb being returned to the long-term rental market. New Orleans has zoning laws that restrict holiday rentals to certain locations. Scotland has recently introduced similar laws requiring permission for short-term lets in certain planning control areas. And let's also forget, Mr. President, that a lot of these properties are being charged a residential rate by their councils, yet they're operating potentially a private business. So there is an area for further regulation. And that's why the Greens are calling upon the Malinauskas government to regulate the short-term rental market here in South Australia by capping the number of nights a property can be rented as short-term accommodation, capping the number of properties that can be rented for short-term rental accommodation, and incentivising the owners of those properties to return them to the long-term market. And I thank you for your indulgence, Mr. President. That's all from me on the rental market for today. I will be revisiting the issue when Parliament resumes, and I know everybody will be engaging in that debate. Thank you, Mr. President.